You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the Monday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Mathieu in Washington, where there are not many left. The House is gone. As we told you the end of last week, there are some senators still in town waiting maybe for something to happen on a deal with the border. But the language we heard, despite a flurry of negotiating over the weekend, does not sound great. Not that this has been derailed, but the idea of it happening by the end of the year might be a bit of a stretch. And that's not good news for Ukraine, which, of course, would be forced to wait for funding that's been requested now for some time. And as I read on the terminal, a new warning from the Pentagon, a letter just obtained from Bloomberg News. Before we talk to Melinda Haring, it's very important. The Pentagon says it will run out of money. And we knew this from Shalanda Young at the administration, that the end of the year would not be good for financing Ukraine. But now we have details. We have a level of detail we did not have before. Pentagon will run out of money to replace weapons sent to Ukraine by December 30, unless, of course, some miracle happened on Capitol Hill. Spending now the last $1 billion to buy new weapons and equipment that will replace those drawn down from stockpiles and sent to Ukraine. This is from the Pentagon controller. A December 15 letter that we have obtained says that on December 30, 15 days after this letter was sent, its accounts will be empty. Now, that was the message over the weekend from Chris Van Hollen, the Democratic senator from Maryland, on ABC This Week, without necessarily those details, but certainly the same spirit. Here he is.
We need to make sure that we help our Ukrainian friends against Putin's aggression, not just to protect their freedom, but because it would send a terrible signal around the world to our allies who would no longer trust us and to our adversaries who would be emboldened if we're not doing that.
That's where we begin our conversation with Melinda Haring, and I have a lot more questions for Melinda than just beyond this, but quite a starting point for us here. Of course, a voice of assurance and authority on this topic, and has been with us talking about this since the very beginning, the very early stages of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and back with us now live on Bloomberg Sound On. Melinda, it's great to see you. You have a date to circle now on the calendar. What does that mean in your calculation as you watch the lack of action here in Washington?
Hey, Joe, thanks for having me back. So I'm fresh in from Kiev, and I think I still have those sort of Ukraine goggles on, and it's really scary. There is a lot of gratitude in Ukraine for everything that Washington has done, but there's also frustration. I think that folks in Ukraine don't understand how desperate the situation is. So there's not enough ammo, and that's been well documented. There's not enough men. It's cold, it's winter, and what Washington does, others will do. So I think all eyes are on Congress, but it looks like this is going to get pushed back to January. And we know the longer this goes on, the more likely it's going to be difficult to pass. And frankly, it's not really a Ukraine issue anymore. The Congress is not going to move until this national security bill, this border issue, is resolved. So it's incumbent on the White House to make this happen if they really want to make sure that Ukraine can win the war.
Well, if this is a month, if you're right, and a lot of folks seem to think that could happen, Melinda, there's a deal on the border. Maybe over the holidays, lawmakers come back, they pass the bill and get it done. Money goes to Ukraine, maybe late January, February, I think is kind of the timeline you're working on there. Did we just send them enough in this latest $1 billion, or apparently last for now, $1 billion tranche to get them through that period of time?
I don't know exactly. I don't have the numbers in front of me, Joe, but what I do know is that there's not enough ammunition. And the Ukrainians announced today they don't have enough Soviet ammunition. And this is something they've been pleading and begging for. The Europeans promised to put supply chains in place to build the ammunition they needed. The United States also promised to put those things in place, and it hasn't happened. So we're months and years behind the reality on the ground, and it's going to cause commanders and generals in Ukraine to have to make decisions that they don't want to make. It's going to limit their military options. So the decisions that we're making here in Washington have real life consequences for Ukrainian soldiers. But I think let's broaden this a bit. This is not just about Ukraine. You and I have talked about this, a dozen times. What happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. That's why it's so crucial to get these funds to Ukraine, and the broader picture too. Also in Europe, we saw last week Orban is vetoing an enormous $54 billion from the EU. And that's the money that keeps the state afloat. So Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine is precarious on a number of different levels.
There's so much to ask you about here, Melinda. Before I get to that EU funding, talk to me more about this supply chain, because this has been in the air essentially since the first batch of weapons we sent, because we knew it would be difficult to replace them. We don't have the supply chain or the manufacturing chain here in the U.S. to take care of ourselves, never mind Ukraine. And you've just pointed to an important promise from our European allies as well. What should be up and running right now? What do we need to build?
So the Europeans and the Americans need to basically move to a war footing in terms of getting the Ukrainians the kind of shells they need. The Ukrainians have been very explicit, Joe, on these are the sort of precision weapons that we need. These are the right ammo we need. And it's a complicated process, and we haven't put it in place. So, if we want Ukraine to win the war, President Biden has the authority to make this happen. European governments can stand this up. It's really a question of political will.
The ask from the White House is roughly $60 billion, most of which actually would be invested here in the U.S. in our own defense contractors. But you pointed out the EU. That's $55 billion, Melinda, and the EU now will hold a special summit, I read, on the 1st of February to discuss this 4-year funding package, which is being held up by opposition from Viktor Orban, of all people. How important is that money when we try to frame the urgency around the request here in the U.S.? Where would this money go, and how badly does Ukraine need it now?
So desperately is the right word. There's 3 categories of aid. There's the military assistance, and the U.S. is the leader on that. We've done an awesome job. We haven't done enough. We've been way too slow, especially on the ammo side, and we haven't sent enough weapons. When I was in Kiev last week, I met with a parliamentarian, and he said, "Thank you for the ATACMS, but 35, give me a break." Like we need hundreds. We need as many as possible. So there's the military side. There's the economic side, and the EU has been the leader on this. And this is the money that keeps the state alive. It keeps the railways going. It keeps homes lit. It keeps pensions paid. This is really important, and the EU has been the leader on this. So if the EU can't get this through, it's going to make it much, much harder for Ukraine as a state to exist. And then the third bucket is the humanitarian assistance.
Manpower is something that you mentioned, and we talked about this when you were just back last week. It's not just men to fight, young, strong men to fight, but just people to help with this response and to keep society going here, Melinda. Put that in perspective for us.
Sure. So, Joe, in October, I went out to Zaporizhia, which is one of the provinces that Vladimir Putin claims he now belongs to Russia. And I spoke to a number of people, and the feeling there among Ukrainian soldiers is that we Ukrainian soldiers who have been fighting for more than 600 days are sticking our necks out, and all of society in Ukraine is not helping. Some people are having normal lives, and they haven't done enough. And that there needs to be a bigger mobilization, and that President Zelensky needs to put the economy on a war footing, and everyone needs to be contributing so that the war can be ended as soon as possible. I've heard that sentiment again and again, and I would say that that's growing frustration in Ukraine right now.
We're spending time with Melinda Haring from the Atlantic Council amid this debate in Washington on whether to or how to or to what extent the U.S. should be funding Ukraine. President Zelensky was here not that long ago while you were in Kyiv, as a matter of fact, Melinda. He understands the debate here in the United States, the political element here domestically that's impacting funding for his own country. What do people in Kyiv say about this?
What do people in Kyiv say about Zelensky's visit? I think they're glad that
the fact that we're holding this up actually on our own border dispute. That's something that he's aware of. He's a politician. He's in touch with Joe Biden. But what do people walking around Kyiv say about securing the border in El Paso?
They're so confused, Joe. They're like, why are you guys conflating the two? What do these have to do with each other? And the answer is, we don't know. They're totally unrelated. And then, I have to explain wonderful American domestic politics, that this is a way to get something that the GOP wants and give Biden a black eye. But in Ukraine, when there's air sirens, in the front lines, when it's a matter of life and death, this feels really silly. It's really hard to explain how petty the politics are here in a war zone.
General Mark Kimmett here on this program, Melinda, suggested that if there was a lapse in funding, if that had to happen, that landing in the middle of a bitter cold winter might in fact be the best time for it to, as fighting begins to slow down. I wonder if you agree with that, knowing the hell that Ukrainian soldiers are about to go through.
I think the general has a point, Joe. So I don't agree on humanitarian assistance, but on military assistance, if you have to pick a point to slow it down, sure, that makes sense. And we're at a bit of a lull right now. It's still a hot war, but it's there's limited options you have during a winter period. But from a humanitarian perspective, if you can't heat homes, if you don't have water, if the trains can't run, if you can't pay pensions, and it's 20 degrees, you're going to have a big humanitarian crisis. And I think the bigger point is that's what Vladimir Putin wants. We discussed this many times. What was the rocket strategy last year that Putin threw all over Ukraine? And it was to try to create a massive migration and scare the hell out of people so that they would leave and go to Europe. And he did not accomplish that. So, in some ways, Putin is getting what he wants sort of piece by piece and incrementally. And if I have to sum up where I think we are, I think this is the strategy. He doesn't have to unleash this horrible, super aggressive rocket strategy. If you look at the number of rockets he's shooting this year compared to last year, the number is quite a bit lower. And I think Putin thinks he has the West and Ukraine exactly where he wants us. He's very tactical and he's very patient, and he thinks that he cares more about Ukraine than the West does.
Wow. Chilling analysis from Melinda Haring. Melinda, thank you for your firsthand accounts and your insights today, as always. I look forward to these conversations. She's senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Melinda Haring with us live on Bloomberg. Let's assemble the panel so Rick and Jeanne can take a swing at what we have here. Our signature panel is back today, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, there was some skepticism, maybe I can use that word, on Capitol Hill when the White House sent a letter about when Ukraine funding would run out here. Now we've got it from the Pentagon. Does that create any new urgency?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more urgency. It's not like the Senate negotiators don't already know that. Maybe it puts a little pressure on the House guys as they are at home having to explain this to their constituents. But it also, foretells a story about how equipped is the Department of Defense and the Biden administration in being able to support this to begin with. I mean, we just heard from Melinda about, how frustrated the Ukrainians have been about not getting enough weapon systems on time, to be able to fight the war that they're trying to fight. And I think the Biden administration has to really calibrate. Are they really ready to support this, especially if there's not an immediate funding between now and the end of the year?
Does a letter like this matter, Jeanne, when the whole thing rides on a border deal?
Does matter. But, I thought what Melinda said to you, which was so chilling, was not only the description of the cold and the lack of men and the lack of ammunition, but the confusion of Ukrainians. I mean, there's confusion for Americans, but imagine the confusion for Ukrainians, thinking that their future depends on a border deal between the U.S. and Mexico to address a problem that has been vexing us for decades. So you can just really, really feel their pain and frustration on this. And yet, as we look at what's happening in Congress, and I know we're going to talk about that, it doesn't sound like they're going to get any, at least in the short term, any relief or any clarification or clarity on that. And it's got to be just, god awful for them sitting over there watching this.
Well, Jeanne is right. We're going to flip the coin on this, talk about the border deal or lack thereof next on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
So as I mentioned, the senators are still kicking around Washington. I mean, I guess it's a pretty good time to be here. They've got the Christmas tree up across the street, the city center there. The Capitol tree is pretty nice, and you can park kind of anywhere right now, maybe get a table at your favorite restaurant. The problem is the border deal they were supposed to be sticking around for does not appear to be emerging. And that may be all right, considering the fact that, for the last 20 or 30 years, we haven't been able to get this done. So another 5 minutes, maybe this bleeds into January, if you ask Lindsey Graham. And of course, all this at the expense of the people of Ukraine, as we were just discussing with Melinda and the panel. Lindsey Graham on Sunday morning TV says, don't hold your breath.
Well, I think this will go into next year. I've been talking to the people at the table. The White House got engaged 5 days ago. They sent over a supplemental with border security provisions that did nothing to change policy. We've been talking to them since September. 5 days ago, they finally sat at this table. Senator Lankford's doing a good job. The bottom line here is we feel like we're being jammed. We're not anywhere close to a deal. It'll go into next year.
A lot of talk about being jammed now. Interesting. As we hear from the players at the table, James Lankford, Chris Murphy, Kyrsten Sinema, they say they're making progress. But look, there's a lot of details here. Even on the big strokes, behind all of them, there are great details. Mitch McConnell and Senator Lankford, by the way, sent a note to colleagues. Remember, we talked about the Dear Colleague letter. It's never good. In this case, says Republicans will not be rushed to a deal this week. And if Chuck Schumer moves forward with plans for a procedural vote, as he promised to, quote, it would not succeed, unquote. So let's reassemble the panel for their take. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, of course, with us here, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, I don't know where we're going here. Everyone could look like a genius if a deal emerges, say, the first or second week of January. How much space should we give them?
Yeah, look, I mean, you're going to have to give them whatever space you can because it's the only game in town. And I think the Dear Colleague letter was just a rearguard action to try and keep some of the caucus, like Lindsey Graham, quiet because they've been upset that they don't know the details of this negotiation. So, look, anytime you have a group of people, especially a tri-party negotiation like this with Sinema and Lankford and Murphy, a Democrat, a Republican, and an independent, all trying to negotiate a deal, everybody in those other caucuses, the R's and the D's, are going to feel left out and concerned. And so all of a sudden Biden comes in there and starts saying, hey, we got to really get this done for the people of Israel, for the people of Ukraine, for our southern border. Then they're going to feel jammed. My own view, I think the White House ought to turn its time and attention on the Democrats, get them to say yes to a deal. It's much more important, frankly, for the Democrats to get a deal than it is for Republicans right now. But bottom line is, sure doesn't sound like a deal's imminent. And so we're talking about a completely insane January, considering all the things that Congress are going to have to do within 30 days of coming back on the 8th of January.
I say we just go to Des Moines and we'll hide there, Rick and Jeanne, until this is sorted out. I don't know, Jeanne. I want to hear from you on this. Let's say Joe Biden does start calling Democrats. I don't know what progress he can make without something a little bit more detailed to sell. But you hear Lindsey Graham there, a lot of backhands at the White House. Hey, they just started 5 days ago. Should Joe Biden have gotten on this earlier?
Yeah, I have to agree on that. I think the White House needed to be present earlier on this. But quite frankly, that said, I'm not sure it would have helped. He's got a real problem on his hands. Number one, he decided to put all of this forward in one big lump. And of course, You're talking about some of the most vexing problems. And while it made sense in one perspective, if this thing doesn't turn out, there's going to be a lot of rethinking about this approach. And so I think the White House has got to own that part of it. Of course, the incentives for Republicans to do anything on the border at this point are nil. And we heard from Donald Trump over the weekend. Does anybody think he is going to help make this an easy vote for any Republicans? that's the reality. He doesn't want anything on the border, a deal for Biden. He also doesn't want to support Ukraine. You couple that with what's happening on the left. Progressives don't want Biden to give away the store. So this is a huge, enormous challenge. And, January 8th, Langford is saying they might have something to do. Well, they've got a lot to do. They return. There's the Iowa caucus. Four departments run out of money on the 19th. The 29th, we have New Hampshire. And then right after that, the rest of the government runs out of funding. So the idea that you're going to fix the border in any kind of concerted way in those couple weeks is really, really tough to imagine at this point.
I shouldn't be laughing, but just listening to you two guys describe January, I'm taking the month off. Rick, Jeanne brings up a really interesting point here, and that's Donald Trump, because I don't know which way this cuts. We understand now that he is in regular talks. He's in regular contact with Speaker Mike Johnson. So what happens if Donald Trump tells Republicans to vote against a deal?
Yeah, I think that it just depends upon what the terms of the bill is going to be. First of all, getting Mike Johnson to put it on the calendar will be number one. If there's a Senate deal, it'll go on the House calendar. The question is, will it be a bipartisan vote? Typically, it would be a bipartisan vote. We've seen over 300 members willing to support these kinds of transactions. It doesn't really matter what the Freedom Caucus thinks about this or Donald Trump if you have 200 Democrats voting with you. So, look, I think that the House is going to take care of itself. Donald Trump is lobbying against Ukraine funding. He's lobbying against funding for the border. The last thing he wants to do is these things become Republican orthodoxy, because he's way outside of the normal Republican level of support for these things. Even the public, Republicans support it more than Donald Trump does. So the last thing he wants to do is have to react to this when he's fighting away, as Jeanne said, in Iowa on the 15th and the 23rd in New Hampshire. These are not things he's going to spend time talking about. So I don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting, because if the House does take it up and it keeps it as an open vote, I think it could be an incredible rebuke to Donald Trump at the hands of, his sort of, favorite speaker today.
Well, it would be, which is why I am deeply curious about that. And I think, to your point, Jeanne, he's not going to like anything that comes up here that doesn't involve a wall with his name on it. I didn't know if I should bring this up or not. I've got to ask you both about this little scandal that came up over the weekend. A Senate staffer is out of a job, a staffer to Senator Ben Cardin, after recording a graphic sex tape. This is real. In the historic Hart 216 hearing room. The encounter, we'll say, happened on the dais. The Daily Caller out with tapes over the weekend. I'm just wondering if this is done. I have to ask you guys about it. Our listeners and viewers, I don't think, would forgive me if I didn't. This is all I heard about for half the weekend. Jeanne, does there need to be an investigation, or he got fired, so let's move on? Because this won't help the way people look at the Hill.
I wish you had gone to Rick Davis on this first, because he's going to have a lot to say on this. No, I think he fired. He should have been fired. Obviously, I did not see the tapes, assuming they are real. And there does need to be an investigation, because, my gosh, are our government buildings just open for these kinds of things? Well,
that's the question.
It's baffling to me that this could happen. I kept thinking it was a deep fake. I'm not saying it was, but I sort of hope it was, but I have no evidence that it was.
You hoped it was.
So,
that's the question, Rick.
This
is, I'm going to him right now. Look, I mean, there's a lot of salacious stuff you could talk about here, but are we to believe that all these rooms are open for access? This is same room played host to Supreme Court nominees, 9/11 Commission hearings. This is right where Senator Chris Coons was sitting, for crying out loud. Should we be concerned?
I don't think you have to be too concerned about staffers going into hearing rooms, right? If this was, just a couple of people walking through the Capitol on a tour and decide to have sex in a hearing room, that'd be one thing. I'd be more concerned about the cleanliness of that hearing room the next time they take a seat on that dais.
I hope there's a real effort to do that. We'll move on from here, but my goodness, someone need to call the sergeant at arms. You were both very graceful with that, by the way. I just, everyone's kicking out this homemade video. What do the Capitol Police have? Aren't there cameras in all these rooms? I digress.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz. And as I mentioned, Kailey, there are a couple folks left. A couple senators are knocking around. Yep. They were hoping to get to a deal on the border. It's looking like that would take a Christmas miracle. But there are a couple of other things they might need to get done. What do we have? Military promotions in the air?
11 of them, yes.
4 stars. This brings us back to the Tuberville blockade. And then there's the matter of the FAA reauthorization.
Which has to be done by year end.
Right. So it could be a pretty short menu by the time they're done.
I'd like to do an extension on FAA, which is what I hear they're going to do, right?
Hey, Mick Mulvaney's here.
Did you hear that voice?
Yeah. That was like a stealth introduction.
Is that? Yeah. I can never tell the difference between radio and TV, so I just pretend it's radio.
We can't either because now they're all the same.
But Kailey, I thought they could do an FAA extension until March or April by the end of the year, not a full reauth.
That's right.
Is that changed?
It would be a short-term kick it to next year. We'll figure it out then.
Right.
As they like to do here in Washington.
Mick Mulvaney cannonballs into the pool.
I didn't realize I wasn't on.
In the
I'm
best
sorry.
way.
I just thought we were chatting.
Of course, we don't. I mean, do we need to tell everyone every week? It's
no.
Former acting.
No, I was chess club president in high school.
Is that true?
Oh,
that's great.
Add that one to the resume.
I could learn a lot from
one
you
more
still.
Bullet.
Obviously,
there weren't a lot of members of the club. So.
We're not getting a deal this week, right? Can we just go?
So. I don't think so. When granted, anything can change at any time. When any politician tells you they know exactly what's going on, you can completely, mostly throw out the window. So when Lindsey Graham says, we're not going to get a deal this week, I think, we might not get a deal this week. But if you get a deal tomorrow, they'll be the first ones to say, oh, yeah, I always knew we were going to get a deal. So I always take that with a grain of salt.
Sure.
I just don't get the feeling, especially with the House gone now.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the new speaker bringing the House back this week? Really, really, really hard to do.
Yeah,
but to have a deal they could come back to might be.
Correct.
Right.
But
helpful.
if your deadline, and how hard is the December 31st deadline? Really, I think that's worth
on
having a discussion
Ukraine.
about on Ukraine funding.
Okay.
Yeah. I've been watching the show.
Yeah.
From the green room, and I'm trying to articulate exactly. I try to say something without sounding like I'm being nasty. So I'm going to put myself in the role of OMB, who are the folks who came out and said the money runs out on December 30th. Mm-hmm. If I was still at OMB. And Nancy Pelosi was in charge of the House, and I put out a press release that said the money for Ukraine is going to run out on December 30th, and she didn't want to give any money to Ukraine. She would completely ignore it as a partisan hack, sort of using my office to advance a political thing. She'd throw it away. Is what it comes down.
How about if it's from DOD?
Same thing.
Same letter?
Same thing.
Same
Especially
people.
if it's the Trump DOD, right?
Okay.
I mean, so is politics in everything? Yeah. Is the issue on funding Ukraine real? Yes. I'm not sure how seriously the members of Congress look at those deadlines and say, okay, is that a real deadline or is there a couple days in there? There's really not much difference, is there, between January 4th and December 27th? And they're probably right.
Well, except that Bloomberg obtained a letter from the Pentagon that says it's December 30th.
Yeah.
There's going to be no more money. So there is that. But I also feel like the Senate seems like it's taking the deadline more seriously, right? Chuck Schumer kept people around. These negotiators are still in the room. They're talking to the White House. Should the House be involved in these conversations if ultimately this is going to be a bill the House has to pass too? I just wonder if everyone's going to work so hard to come to a deal and then not all parties agree to it.
Yeah, I think in a perfect world that would be the way it works. Keep in mind, Washington doesn't function properly right now, so I mean that's not what I don't get the impression that is happening. Are they communicating? Certainly. Is this a four corners sort of a group of 8 combination of the House and the Senate talking about it? No, they're not. But that's not as partisan as it is institutional. You've covered this a long time. Regardless of which parties are in charge of the House and the Senate, there's still that institutional tension between those two bodies. And the Senate, when they cut a deal, are going to expect their deal to pass, and the House, when they cut a deal, is going to expect their deal to pass, right? But it never happens like that. So should they be doing that? Yeah. Are they? Probably at a very low level, but clearly this is not an equal discussion between the House and the Senate. And does that mean that it's going to take longer? Yes, it does.
And everyone's afraid to get jammed by the other chamber. Right. What do you make of this revelation that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is now communicating regularly with Donald Trump? Would you expect that to be the case? And how much can the former president thumb the scale on this?
Oh, The second question is really interesting. The first question is not. Yes, it makes complete sense for the Speaker of the Republican House of Representatives to be speaking to the de facto leader of the party.
Closest thing to the standard bearer.
Exactly, and the likely nominee. That, in fact, if they weren't having the conversation, we'd be asking probably harder questions. Whether or not Trump could put his thumb on the scale depends on whether or not, in part, he wants to. I'm not sure he has a position on this yet, and Trump won't take a position, if he's not there yet. Yeah. So I'm not sure I don't know where he is on funding Ukraine. My guess is he's against it, but he's for funding the border and for funding support for Israel. So, it might be one of those things that doesn't fall neatly in any package. Do I think he could put the thumb on the scale with a couple of members? Probably. Are those the members?
He doesn't want Joe Biden to get a deal on the border.
Yeah, unless it's a really, really good deal and he can take credit for it. Yeah. I mean, that's the beauty, right? If Donald Trump can deliver the votes to get the deal and it's a good deal, maybe. But you're right. The starting position, I'll agree with you, is that the last thing that Trump wants politically is for Biden to be able to declare a victory this close to the midterm, to the election.
Well, we also had the former president weighing in when we first thought the government was shutting down. He seemed to be encouraging the crowd that said, hey, shut it down, see what happens.
He had that chance a couple times when I was there.
Yeah.
And he had a budget director who really, really wanted him to shut the government down a couple times. And we did it once.
You sure
seriously,
did.
Indeed.
We signed a bunch of spending bills that I wish that we had not, and he wished he had not after he signed them.
Well, and we'll see if he has to weigh in again come January 19th, February 2nd, when we're dealing with potentially a two-tiered
5 minutes after Iowa.
Getting closer and closer to Iowa.
Government shutdown. To go back to this idea that Joe raised of Mike Johnson having really close communication with the former president, I wonder if the former president might ultimately be the best ally he had, because how many allies does he realistically have in Congress right now?
Talk about Mike.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, it's sort of when Donald Trump got to Washington, I always said one of his greatest strengths was he didn't have any relationships in town. And one of the greatest weaknesses he had was he didn't have any relationships in town.
And the same is true of Mike Johnson.
Exactly. It can cut both ways. Mike does not have the baggage that McCarthy had and, bad experiences in the past, for example, with, certain members. But he also hasn't been out there raising the money for the last 10 years, and he doesn't have that goodwill built up. So he can cut absolutely both ways. Again, come back to the threshold question. It would be strange for Mike Johnson not to be talking to Donald Trump. I think that the fact that he's talking to him isn't really that remarkable.
So take us for a walk. What's your view here? I mean, do you have a kind of a path in your head about what the next month looks like? Because there's a lot that needs to get done.
Yes,
the next month. We're not going to shut down. We're going to get a border deal that makes all this happen.
I remember back when I used to campaign for a living, and people say, "Oh, it's not." I hate that Washington isn't more bipartisan. And I'm like, no. The problem is it's too bipartisan. Because there's one thing that everybody can agree on.
We're getting emails on this one.
I know, and that's spending more money. And that's what they will agree on. They will figure out a way to give everybody enough of what they want to pass a Ukraine funding bill, an Israeli funding bill, a Taiwan funding bill, and a border security bill. And they will keep the government open because the spending numbers will just keep going up and up and up until they buy enough votes.
Chip Roy's head will explode.
That's how you get 30.
I was going to say, not everyone wants to spend more money.
No.
You have members of the Freedom Caucus that are pushing for pretty draconian cuts.
Yeah. You don't get $33 trillion in debt by accident. And you don't get it with one party doing it to you. Both parties hold hand in hand to get you $33 trillion in debt. The only thing this town can agree on in a bipartisan fashion is spending more money.
So Bob Good's running the Freedom Caucus now, we understand. A good steward. He's not getting along with Kevin McCarthy, who we hear is going to try to primary him. What's the next year look like for the Freedom Caucus?
Oh, it's rough all over the place. It's going to be rough in the House. I've had folks call me about the Nancy Mace race down in South Carolina. I live in South Carolina still. I went home after I left Washington. And there are folks, trying to line up to run against Nancy. And there's folks asking me, who should run against Nancy. So
asking you to run again?
No. Who do I know? It's a different district. It's down in Charleston. Okay. Not that makes a difference. As you know, you don't have to live in your district. Little piece of political trivia. Exactly. There used to be 4 members of Congress who lived in one district in Wisconsin. But that's another story for another day. There's going to be a lot of internal bloodbaths over that. When Patrick McHenry, now I've not talked to Patrick, so I'm not giving away any private conversations. When Patrick McHenry announced he was retiring from Congress, to me that was the biggest red flag that the Republicans themselves think they are going to lose the majority.
Wow.
Because Patrick, even though he was term limited, technically, could have easily received an exemption to maintain his position as chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. So there's a guy that if he wins and they hold the majority, he's going to be financial services chairman, and he announces he's leaving. To me, that tells me that he doesn't think that we're going to keep the majority. And when you break it down and you talk about Republicans fighting against Republicans in certain districts, you talk about losing Kevin McCarthy and his ability to raise all that money, a lot of the things that are lining up to have a tough year for the House Republicans. Does Donald Trump make that better or worse? That's really sort of the unknown at this point. But right now, if you had to bet, you'd bet that the Republicans would struggle to keep the House, and that also doesn't breed a lot of goodwill in that building.
So you think it's not that people are deciding to retire because of dysfunction, but maybe they recognize the dysfunction is going to cost them?
It's a variety of things, right? There's so many of them, Kailey, that it's hard to sort of paint with a broad brush. Some of them are retiring to run for higher office. Some of them are retiring because they've been here forever. And then some are retiring because they might think they're losing the majority. Some of the time because it's just not fun anymore. And it really isn't. And are the people who are running for higher office saying, well, I wasn't going to run for higher office, but this place is so miserable, so why not take a chance at running for higher office? So it can be a combination of all things. But this is when you walk into the building, and I'm in the building not that much, but more than the average citizen, it's not friendly right now. And that's the members that's people intra-party, and it's not just Republicans. Democrats have their own issues. It's institutional, and it's across party lines. It's tough right now.
So much for the Christmas spirit.
Yeah.
Yes. Was it fun when you started?
Was it fun when I started?
Or has that just been your tenure?
I think things have certainly changed. I think that we've gone. It's the Vivek Ramaswamy phenomena and Vivek Ramaswamy is someone who came of age in politics during the Donald Trump era. So for someone who's only been involved in politics for 6 or 7 years, Donald Trump looks normal. Wow. Donald Trump can get away with what Donald Trump does because he's a unique thing. He is a black swan event, right? Yeah. But everybody else is out there thinking, well, if I act like Donald Trump, I'll be as successful as he is on both parties. And that's not the way that things are supposed to work, and it's the reason things aren't working.
Great to see you in person.
Oh, come on.
A week from today is Christmas, right? I would have said
something uplifting if you'd asked me.
Well, a week from today is Christmas, is it not? Well, we never ask uplifting. It is, wow.
It is.
You're doing something great
a week from today. In fact, I just got asked to do television on Monday morning at 7 o'clock on News Nation. I'm like,
I'll set a timer.
Maybe that's when you
are we doing this? You guys aren't doing next Monday.
Not a chance, right? No. But I'll see you the week after that.
Good.
See you in the new year.
I just had a phone call about the new government in Argentina. We can do foreign policy.
Wow. All right. Excellent.
Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.